Welcome back to another part of this video, and what we have left off the idea that we can actually have a tool that we currently own. At this case we have created for this one, but also have like certain parameters that changes into different static meshes on the go using this tool. We're gonna actually do this by using data assets, and data assets are sort of like in this case a library of assets that you can implement by adding them into a blueprint, and also creating this using the structure which we're actually going to create all together within this whole process of this exercise. So basically what we're gonna do is to create a data asset that works with structure, but at the same time it then feeds into a PCG and utilize this data assets to use the different static meshes that we're gonna implement it into this PCG structure within the interior space here. In this case, what we're gonna do is first create a folder here. Let's create a folder. I'm gonna call it data assets, and right click. I'm gonna search for structure. It's under blueprints. Let's call it as trees. So if we open this up, what's going to happen? Now we are going to add some of these values. So basically the whole principle of this, we're going to create a data asset. They utilize any other models that we want to add them on the runtime while we are editing inside that within this viewport here while we are working this tool of the environment tool. So what we're going to do is to set up to call this mesh. This is going to be our mesh. So I'm going to set this to our static mesh. Add weight to it. And let's set this to float. So we're going to be able to change these different static meshes, which is going to be our foliage, and also control the weight by seeing what comes as first comparing to the other static meshes that are already spawned into our PCG here. So, and this can also allow us to change the values to have different priorities. And I'm going to also minimize this. Another thing I'm going to do is also create blueprint. It's going to be our primary data asset here. So let's call it PDA dynamic mesh. And next thing what we're going to also do, I'm going to add a variable here, and I'm going to call dynamic mesh. Let's set this to our structure that we just created. So I'm going to call this as trees. Let's go tree. I'm also going to make sure it's an array. That means we can choose more than one tree. I'm going to expose this and to make it public. And that's pretty much done for now. Another thing what we need to do is to right click and also type in here called look for data asset. And with the data asset we're going to use for this is that the one we just created, which is our dynamic mesh. Let's call it DA dynamic mesh. So now what we can actually do is open this up and we can start adding our meshes for the trees. So let's say I want to add 3 different trees. So in this case, we can have a European beach. So let's say it's the first one. So make sure you set to 1 our weight. And also let's start looking for more trees. So I'm going to pick any random trees that I can come up with. Let's minimize this. And I'm going to add another tree, add this here. And then I'm going to do the same for our one too. And set it to 1. Let's save that. And what we can then next do, let's go back to our PCG forest. Because we're currently only detecting static meshes which are literally being added for the mesh entries on the static mesh border, but because we're gonna reverse this by actually creating a parameter inside the graph settings that utilizes data asset that we just created and use this to expose this directly to blueprint, which means then we can use this data asset to change on the go instead of going as to PCG here graph. So that helps us to not organize, but also makes it a little bit more life easier for us to not just deal within the PCG graph, but we can actually do that externally. So let me just go and remove all of these stuff here, and let me just disconnect it for now. What we're actually going to do is to first create a property that reads our data assets. So in this case, right click, let's search for get property from the object path. And in this case, our object path is going to be dynamic mesh. Of course, at the moment, it just has a path to it, but for the property, which is going to be our, in this case, mesh later on. But because we also need to make sure it matches the attribute that comes with it for the mesh, so we need to also look for match and set attributes. But remember, the only way you can get this working is if you have your plugin, in this case, under plugins folder, that comes under edit and the plugins tab. If you go to PCG and make sure your procedural content generation framework PCG geometry script interrupt is enabled. Otherwise, you might not be able to get this set of parameters that are going to work with the here static PCG framework itself. Let's go and carry on. And because we already have a weight inside our data asset we just created, so I'm going to basically add this to also our enable to match weight attribute. So that helps to work with the attribute that are being added to data asset. And I'm going to just connect this together with that. And I'm going to directly add to the static mesh spawner here. So, but because currently we need to also make sure we set the selector type to work with attribute. And in this case, it's going to be mesh. And the reason why we call it mesh, because as you remember, if you look it up your structure here, our structure has its mesh component that I was called under mesh. And that's why also, if you think about it, our match set and attribute, we also trying to match the attribute naming by weight, because all of this corresponds to given the structure within this, in this case, structure blueprint here. So that's why we always have to make sure these naming convention matches to the nodes that we have here added inside our PCG graph. So keep that in mind. And also what we're gonna do now is we are going to add another parameter. So let's go and click on the graph settings here and let's add the parameter because we're gonna use this to expose this later in our actor blueprint. So in this case, I'm gonna look for PDA. The one we're looking is the dynamic mesh, and let's call it dynamic mesh. So in this case, we have this dynamic mesh, which is this one. Now let's go and connect that together like this. For now, let's leave it as it is because errors can be a little bit tricky because sometimes it gives you errors, but it doesn't mean it's not working. Let's go and then our blueprint, which is this one here. Let's create a new variable. Look for PDA. Dynamic mesh, that one we have. And I'm just going to expose this so to make it public too. And I'm going to call it mesh. In this case, I'm going to drag it out, make it as a get variable. And what we're going to use for this one, we're actually going to use a set object. So if I go drag it out from the graph instance, I'm going to look for set object parameter. And that's the one we're actually going to use it. Make sure your naming convention meets the same naming, which should be dynamic mesh. That's right. So I'm going to just plug this in and compile that. So now let's see what happens. So now we have our, in this case, data exposed, so we can pick it up and search for it, and we can add it to it. But it looks like we got some errors here. I've just checked what we need also to add because we already have this parameter we've created. So we just basically need to add this parameter into this one and literally plug this together with this get property object path. So then if we compile it and check that what happens in scene, now we start getting the results we wanted to get in the first place. And that's very cool. And now you can see you can do major changes inside your data asset, and whatever changes you want to do, also you can swap it to different foliages and then do changes that you want to go on the go. And that goes the same as you want to just do any other operation that comes with that. Another thing which I really wanted to do before we can close this chapter a bit is to also create this called a PCG stamp. What I'm trying to say by PCG stamp is that every time you work with something and possibly you wanted to perhaps leave it as it is, so you decided just maybe let's just make it a little bigger. You decided to keep it as it is. For example, you're very happy with the results. So then what we can do is to click on PCG and just go, and as you can see here, it has these parts of the functionalities as part of PCG component. You can either clean up or regenerate your grass here. Watch out, sometimes there's some weird bugs that comes with PCG. So every time you spawn it new, you need to sometimes remove it from the outliner and just bring it back here. And let's just apply again. And then you can clean this up and regenerate. And if you're very happy with the results, you can then click on clear PCG link. And then it creates a stamp. and just the stamp separate from the, in this case, from the spline component here, which means it's a separate spline now, and you can regenerate again. And there you go. And that's very handy when once you're very happy and you don't want it to overload your performance. That's something for you to, in this case, generate, and to avoid any further issues, because maybe you just wanted to keep it as it is because you like that style. So you just want to just create a stamp and save it and bake it, literally the entire part of that forest here. So that's something to watch out for. And so that's why I wanted to create this also a button link here inside our, in this case, details panel. So let's create this button that helps us to bake this PCG. So in this case, what I'm going to do is go back into our event graph and right click. And I'm going to literally create those buttons here. I call it bake it. So I'm going to create another custom and call it generate. In this case, what I'm going to do is drag it out of my component, but this time I'm going to search for clear PCG link. And this will be our bake. And I'm going to do the same thing, but for this one to generate. So I'm going to go search for generate. And let's make it force, so it will forcefully generate the results. So in this case, I'm just going to save it and make sure these two have exposed a call and editor. Otherwise, it's just not going to be show up on our details panel outside blueprints. I'm going to just basically make it call on editor. The same goes for this one. I'm just going to compile these two. And basically now, as you can see, we got our graph, so we can move around, whatever you want to do with this. Just create something like that. And let's say I'm very happy, I'm going back and I'm just going to bake it. Did the same thing, generate it. And I'll do it pretty much the same. And I'm happy with this. I'm going to go and bake it. Just like that. It's very cool, right? So it gives you this extra ability not to be only sticking to the idea that you want to just keep creating, keeping the same interior spline inside that closed loop. But at the same time, you want to be versatile and outwards be very diverse in ideas of how you want to just keep it, the shape you want it to. So then you want to bake it, and also helps you to improve the performance so that you don't have to worry about slowing down your projects as well. So that's why it's very handy to work with this kind of options that you can just basically do something like just presented here. And that was it for creating your first environment foliage tool to help you not only speed up your workflow, but at the same time to create anything that you want with using just PCG. And in the next lesson, what we're actually going to do is to use all the assets that we have available here in our, in this case, a project that comes with the whole course itself. And what I'm gonna do is to show you how you can use this asset and also link it up with PCG, and so that it helps you to create a very sophisticated tools to build up your environment. And we're gonna basically use the same similar principles, but a little bit easier. But some of them will be very cool, just like we have with foliage here, and more also interactive and creative too. So thank you so much for going through this together on the foliage tool, and I'm very excited to see you guys in the next lesson.